UFOs burst on the scene in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold's sighting in June 24th, actually. But they had been sighted before that. There were things called Foo Fighters that were seen during World War II, and people saw things before World War II. It's just that they became a public phenomena in June of 1947. And when they did, the government, the U.S. government, took immediate interest in the problem, but not because they thought that UFOs might be extraterrestrial. In fact, there was a survey done of the public in that same time period, and almost no one thought that UFOs could have been extraterrestrial. It just wasn't on people's radar, as it were. They thought that if UFOs were real, they might be secret aircraft from the Soviet Union. Or something of that ilk, but certainly not extraterrestrials or time travelers or anything else. But the government took notice of it because there could have been security implications. And so they soon formed a project, Project Sign, here in the United States to study it. And other governments took notice of it, but the U.S. was in a position to be the leader in this, partly because there were more sightings, for whatever reason, in the United States at the time, but also because of the capability of the U.S. government and all the rest. So the UFO phenomena and its study became then intertwined and caught up in all the issues connected with the government and with the Cold War period that was going on, of course, in the West and really across the whole globe in that era. And eventually, the UK and other Western governments began their own projects, none quite maybe as organized as what became eventually Project Blue Book here in the United States. And so the phenomena did its thing, and the government looked into it. Civilian UFO groups, both here and abroad, were soon formed in the 1950s and began to study UFOs on a parallel track. Now, in this period, UFOs were seen frequently. They often appeared in daylight. They definitely were reported as disc-shaped. Sometimes they landed. Sometimes they, stopped cars, or little creatures were reported getting out. So lots of people saw UFOs, relatively speaking. I mean, thousands of them did. They were reported in the media. The New York Times, for example, had serious stories on UFOs, as did other magazines. And all that went on for many years. It soon became apparent, or at least it became obvious to let's say, to the U.S. government that UFOs were a problem for them, but they were a PR problem, not a scientific problem. They should have been a scientific problem, naturally, or they should have been an intelligence problem in the sense that, well, if something's here and flying around that we don't know what it is, whatever's behind it, we need to be studying it. We need to keep studying it and figure out what's happening. But instead, for a variety of reasons, it became more of a PR problem that had to be downplayed by the U.S. government. And so that's what they arranged to do through the Robertson Panel, which is a well-known a group of scientists that convened to give recommendations to the government that ended up essentially saying that for security reasons and that the best thing to do is to diminish the influence of UFOs in society and treat this again as more of a PR problem rather than a scientific problem. Well, the government study went on for many years after that and didn't end until late 1969 here in the States, and it actually went on after '69 in Australia and the UK and Italy and other places. But over time, government's interest in UFOs diminished, even though it was a slow process. Meanwhile, civilian interest in UFOs went in exactly the opposite direction. The civilian groups and the public and others became more interested in UFOs. And sightings changed over the years too. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, we began to get more triangle and large boomerang-shaped UFOs. And UFOs also, as we went into the 80s and 90s, we began to get fewer trace cases and fewer vehicle interference cases and fewer CE3s where people report entities. So the phenomena itself has evolved over time for whatever reason, just as our organizational treatment of it for the government changed and diminished over time, whereas again civilian groups got more interested. And then of course, then in the 90s, abduction cases arose. The phenomena changed again, though people have said, well, did the phenomena change or did we change in the way people just reacted and reported it, and that's a long, kind of thing to ponder as to what caused that rise in abduction reports. And then since then, of course, then the internet came in. The mid-90s is about when the internet hit everywhere, and people have now sites like the National UFO Reporting Center, MUFON online forums, and places where people can report their sightings online. Naturally, people are reporting sightings online, and so there was a lull in sightings actually where they really kind of diminished in the 80s and into the early 90s, but now sightings have gone up, not necessarily in quality, but they've gone up in quantity because of the ease of access of reporting. Back in the old days when I got involved, there was only two ways to report a UFO sighting. That was call or write and ask for a report form or send a letter. And either one of those was a little daunting for people. But now we all understand how easy it is to click on a website, click on a form, fill it out, click submit, and it's much easier and not as fraught with tension like actually picking the phone up and calling somebody. I mean, I've talked to many a witness who was pretty nervous about calling the center and reporting on UFOs. Also, one of the things that has changed for the plus, again, when I got involved, even before that, there was a stigma attached to making a UFO report. People who were professionals particularly did not want to become associated with the fact that they had an interest in UFOs, and certainly that they had a sighting. Now, as time has gone on, certainly that there is still that tension, but for the most part, it is acceptable to have an interest, and acceptable to say you've seen a UFO, except maybe in the most elite circles in academia and the media, and places where it's still kind of a taboo subject.